It's been a day. So GM, we're just going to start all over again. GM.
GM.
Oh my, I feel you. I feel you. Cool. Looks like we have everyone. And are we good to get started? Thumbs up.
Yeah, I think we're
I'm
set.
ready.
Sorry, I was running into some tech issues. I think we're good though.
Okay, awesome. Thank you all for joining. This is a Twitter Spaces conversation on DAO governance. I've been thinking a lot about this. This is something I wanted to ask a lot of questions to these amazing folks who are either running their own DAOs or building tools for DAOs. So I think this is a great group of people. We will maybe go around like 40-ish minutes in terms of like conversation, and then would open it up to whoever wants to join the conversation. In the meantime, if you have questions, there is a Twitter thread that's going on. You can post your questions there. But yeah, we will in the end open it up for people to join us on stage. Today I have Kaito here, who is my co-host, and we both will be leading the space. Quick introduction on me. I am currently at Skynet Labs, where we are building the decentralized storage infrastructure for Web3. And I also run a DAO called Komorebi DAO, where we are investing in female founders. Can everyone go around and do a quick 30-second introduction? Maybe Kaito, if you want to go next.
Yeah, sounds good. 30-second background is I'm a co-founder and CEO of Utopia Labs. We're basically the modern system for managing payments, accounting, and reporting for DAOs. We're very early, but just been shipping product, and it's been an awesome experience just being able to build with DAOs from the ground up. So it's been an awesome experience. I'll popcorn it off real quick to Patty.
Hi, I'm Patty Houseman. I'm the operations lead for FWB. Prior to being the operations lead, I was the membership lead at the team. And prior to my life in the Web3 space, I was a longtime music business executive at labels. So that's me, Julia Lipton.
Hi, everyone. My name is Julia. I run a small venture fund called Awesome People Ventures that also has a DAO component, and started a DAO called DAO Masters to help people get up to speed on DAO tools and how to run a DAO. Off to the other Julia, the better Julia.
I am Jules on this Twitter Spaces. I am the co-founder and chiefess of Orca Protocol. We're building flexible and adaptable DAO tools, most importantly pods, which I'm sure we'll talk lots about today. But pods simply are building governance around small working groups of people based on their expertise rather than their token holding. So very excited to talk about governance today and how we can hopefully change the status quo. Off to Kevin.
Hey guys, just wrapping it up. My name is Kevin. I'm the founder of Boardroom Labs. We're building a discovery platform and aggregator for DAO governance, operations, data, and activity. And super excited to kick things off with this amazing group on stage.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you all for joining. Maybe just to set expectations, I want to start with, just this basic question of like, how do you, I guess not how do you define governance, but what do you think governance encompass when we talk about DAO? And I think it is definitely a tricky question to answer, but just quick, in a few sentences, if someone wants to tackle that.
When I think about governance in the DAO space, I think about and I guess like when I think about DAO activity, what DAOs really are is like how we're dealing with the human activity that exists in crypto projects. So I sort of think of it as like automation at the center, humans at the edges, and governance is how we are coming to consensus and coordinating our human activity.
Yeah, tacking onto that point, at the end of the day, like if we really think about what DAOs are enabling us to do, they're really enabling us to do two things, like coordinate human capital or human talent and actual capital, right? Or resources. So I see governance as kind of like the all-encompassing idea, that this is the actual mechanism for a distributed set of different stakeholders and individuals that are working towards a common goal to essentially establish consensus, and ratify ideas in a formalized process.
Love that. Thank you. So, Kevin, just like taking it a little further, when we say stakeholders, I think, at least from my perspective, I think of two kind of stakeholders. One is like the broader community. And there I want to ask a question around how do we go about onboarding and scaling communities when it comes to DAOs. And I know there are two schools of thoughts. One is we can scale and keep growing our DAOs, or there's just this happy medium where a DAO only grows up to X number of participants. So that's, I guess, like that's my first question in terms of like how do we think about scaling and onboarding new members to DAOs?
Just on the first point of stakeholders, before we get into scaling, I think the number one thing that's honestly like should be the first step really when anyone's mapping out or spinning up any DAO is basic stakeholder mapping. Who are going to be your users, who are going to be your expected early adopters and core contributors, and who are going to be the adjacent stakeholders essentially on the outer bounds of your DAO that maybe take a more passive role, less operational role, but where their interests also have to be represented to a certain extent, right? And I think one extremely novel kind of like thing that DAOs bring about, especially in contrast to like corporate governance systems, is that those stakeholders can actually be represented in real time, and we can develop like new experiments in governance and different accountability mechanisms to enable those stakeholders to actually have direct power and influence into the operation and management of like the inner bound or the circle of the DAO. So I think that just drawing that contrast, like when we're thinking about scale or just spinning up an initial DAO, I think something that's like no one ever does, and even looking back to the DeFi DAOs of like DeFi Summer and stuff, we all had this assumption that we had like one stakeholder type that we were tailoring our DAOs to. The user equals the stakeholder. The user should have equal power. And I think what we're realizing now, though, is that like we're developing different user personas, we're developing different contributor types and different stakeholders in order to scale these systems to a greater extent. And with that comes kind of like a responsibility for the DAO creators and DAO operators to identify who the stakeholders are and how they should be represented in these systems. And maybe Julia, you want to, Jules, one of the Julias wants to dive into the scale into the scaling topic, because I'm sure we can get into like pods and substructures in the delegation of responsibility and those accountability mechanisms, which is also super fascinating.
Yes, 100%. I was also going to add on to your stakeholder points, in that something I've been thinking a lot about recently is that if you sort of like look at the legal system today, like it's really just groups of stakeholders that are held accountable to certain agreements that they've made, and like a lawyer's job is to like hold those people accountable to the agreements that they've made within each other. And so I think that's like a big part of like how we need to think about this discussion, is that how are we actually like holding stakeholders accountable to each other? And I think that instead of thinking about like individual stakeholders, we need to be thinking about like groups of stakeholders, like just as it sort of exists in the normal world. And so when I think about scaling DAOs, I think like the biggest issue we're seeing today is that we really don't have many options of coordination mechanisms. Like the only coordination mechanism that exists today is token weighted voting, and I think it's been like very clear and evident over the last few months that token weighted voting has its limitations and like isn't necessarily the path forward for DAOs to scale beyond like where they are now. And I think a lot of that just comes down to human coordination. And so sort of what we're proposing with Orca and pods is we basically need to create like a spectrum of coordination mechanisms that exist outside of just having sort of token weighted voting. So with pods, we're basically building sort of these little stakeholder groups so that you can empower contributors into positions of power give them assets, give them some sense of autonomy in an ecosystem, and to actually make decisions on the larger ecosystem's behalf, rather than every decision having to filter through token-weighted governance. So yeah, there's, I'm sure, a lot of thoughts there, but I'm curious everyone's thoughts
No,
on sort of
I
the
think that's
limitations
super
there.
neat. Like just the way of segmentation in regards to expertise over token weighted makes a ton of sense. I think maybe one question, and I'd love to have the team challenge me here in regards to the way to think about it. But one thing I've been thinking about is that a lot of DAOs are starting to not only just segment by stakeholders, whether it's other DAOs to just the contributors, but then they're actually kind of like segmenting within the contributors, right? And there's obviously a bunch of different rules, whether it's developers, founders, contributors to lurkers. But is there some sort of best practice to establishing ways to onboard select groups within a contributor? So, like one example are people who might be not as active relatively to compared to full-time contributors. So I was wondering, maybe Patty, this might be a good question to ask you on in regards to building a really inclusive onboarding system for all different types of contributors and seeing if there's a best practices established there. I think sub DAOs would be super valuable as well. But yeah, would love to kind of hear what you think there.
Sure. I think FWB has grown at such a clip that we've really actually struggled with that. We've tried to optimize a few on ramps for uh, members to become contributors and then scale up through that ecosystem. We haven't been successful at it yet, but I think I'm hoping that this next season that's coming up, January through March, we're going to try to do a better job in that. But I would love to hear how others are solving for their DAOs right now. We've got about 2,500 members, and it's just a struggle for us to keep up and figure out how to optimize for that.
Wait, sorry, Julie, go ahead.
So at DAO Masters in season 1, we let everyone who wanted to contribute start contributing. And within season 1, which lasted 6 weeks, we ended up having 22 contributors that got paid out at the end of the season. And for season 2, one of the things that we realized is that we were going to need a lot more pods, to use Jules' language. And we decided to put we call them project leads, each project lead of those pods in charge of onboarding. And so each of those leads was responsible for figuring out who they needed to be able to ship their part of the project. And then we had one universal contributor form, and each of the leads then onboarded the people that they wanted to add to their teams. And we still need to do the retrospective to see if this works. But one of the things that I'm quite interested in is distributed onboarding and contributor to contributed onboarding, because I think that's one of the things that allows networks to scale and to scale with the right context within their teams.
So for us, we do have multiple teams. I think we're at a point now, though, where we've got probably about 150 contributors that are paid contributors across multiple teams. So I think we're kind of struggling to figure out how to onboard more effectively.
And do
But
you need to onboard more, right? Like that's
that's
a
another
question.
question, right? That's another question. Ideally, I think ideally we would love as many people that want to contribute to be able to contribute, right? I'm not sure how we are able to scale that up as quickly as the DAO is growing.
Yeah. I mean, the common theme I'm hearing is there is maybe some form of tiered approach where, not every community member is a contributor and not every contributor contributes in the same form or shape. And I just love the whole crypto space because it allows us a lot of like experimentation. And I think just like we are all figuring it out as we go. Jules, did you have?
Yes,
Yeah.
I was going to say one thing is I really like that you asked that question too of like, is FWB even like looking to onboard more people? Because I think there's a bit of like kind of Web 2 mindset that kind of filters in sometimes is like constantly optimizing for the masses. Like, and that's like what Web 2 constantly promotes is like we need more followers, more users, more subscribers, just like more and more people, but without actually optimizing for like the right rails for coordination and collaboration that exists within those communities. And so I think that's like a really great point, and something that I think has been brought up recently is like, and a question I've heard asked is like, how do we actually make DAOs smaller? And I think what that question is asking is just like, how do we find the most like valuable contributors and like kind of, I don't know, maybe like find the best pockets of and like best nuclei of activity that exist in DAOs. So yeah, I was just gonna say that.
Yeah, I love that. I think, there are some challenges on um, just people who are part of DAOs thinking about designing DAOs. On the flip side, I think there are, similar challenges for people who are potentially, just contributing to multiple DAOs. And I think one of the biggest challenge that came up in this like Twitter conversation I was having was communication. I think, we talk a lot about voter apathy or people not voting. But if we dig down into why that's happening, it's just that there's just so much going on. It's a lot harder for people to keep up with if they're part of multiple DAOs. What DAO is having a vote which particular week, and so it makes me question this concept of, are part-time contributors like the optimal path, or do we see a future where DAOs would end up having full-time contributors, essentially people working full-time for DAOs? Wonder people, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think one big distinction that I would make is essentially like, number one, there's over the last like 3 years, we put a lot of emphasis like on looking at participation numbers out of like total like token holder numbers, et cetera, in the space, and we saw essentially kind of like consistent, results under 5%, essentially participation rates in any DAO and any token weighted governance system, pretty much. The question that then people started asking was like, all right, how do we increase that participation number, instead of asking the real question, which is what we're asking in this panel now, is like, are those the right people that should be actually making decisions, or those the right people that should have actual like decision making governance power in these systems in the first place? And to the point of like, contributor versus, governance decision maker, there's actually a big difference between, a token holder who is a passive stakeholder in the system. They may usually make up like 95% of, the folks that are essentially not voting on any given proposal or any given like operational decision that a DAO is making. And then the 5% of like part-time or full-time contributors that are involved in some capacity in like the operation of the DAO, that should be seen as like a completely different stakeholder class, right? Of like who's being represented or not. So to the point, that you're making of like, number one, should these DAOs grow and scale, and should they kind of like involve more and more decision makers in the process? I think the answer that we're getting to here is like, no, probably. Like what we really should focus on, what we should really design for, is essentially finding the right people to make the right decisions, right, and the right people to involve in the right pockets, and provide the right information for the operation and efficiency like of the DAO itself. So I think the first distinction that we have to make is like, who are the actual passive token holders in the system and the stakeholders that need to be represented, but that we know aren't going to engage in the governance and operation of the system. That's probably going to make up 95+% of the token holder base. And then who are the contributors that we actually have to scale this operation alongside with?
That's really interesting, because when I think the harder answer and the harder thing to solve here is the who, in terms of the right person to actually come in and make the right decisions. I'm curious, and this is more of a question like generally in terms of the landscape here, but how could that be determined at the best in terms of potentially non-biased opportunity? Would it be some sort of on-chain or off-chain reputation model, which would basically say, hey, this is probably the right token holder that has probably the best context in terms of making the right decision? What do you think that could look like? Even if there's a solution today, maybe that I just don't know about it. I'm really curious to hear how that process could be in place. Or maybe, Julia, you could talk a bit about your pods and if that's already in place with potentially the solution that you're thinking of. But I think that's a really, really cool, interesting challenge.
Yes, 100%. I think this is super relevant to what we're building. And just to like dig in a little bit more on pods too, what pods specifically are, like technically are multi-sigs with conditional membership. So we're basically creating sort of the ability to have more flexible membership in these sort of small working groups. And then a key part of pods as well is what we call our like pod rules and requirements. And those are custom rules that can be created to sort of basically ensure who is part of a pod. And so when I sort of think about like reputation systems and all of these things, I think it's really difficult to create a single reputation system that fits the model for all DAOs. Like, what Bankless values in a contributor is entirely different than like what Uniswap values in a contributor. And so what we sort of believe like with Orca is that every DAO will basically create like their own criteria and their own kind of individual reputation system based on like how they value contributors. And what we enable with Orca is that you actually get to like point to that reputation system and make decisions on like where people sit in an organization. So, if the Bankless ecosystem decides that they want to be passing out sort of reputation badges that correlate to someone's writing capabilities, then if someone has X, Y, and Z NFT badge, then they get to be part of the editorial pod or sort of all of these different pods within an ecosystem. So yeah, I think reputation is going to be more unique to like specific DAOs. And I think it's important that we like create the infrastructure to actually point to that reputation and then allow contributors to actually elevate based on those sort of credentials.
I would love to hear from like DAO masters or like FWB perspective, how has your journey been in terms of attracting the right contributors and even defining what that looks like?
I think because of the way our community started, it started as, friends of the founders who were already in creative spaces. I feel like we've had really good luck, especially with our full time and part time team. And I think earlier you had asked the question, will people work full time for DAOs? I'm a full time employee of FWB. There are, I think, another 5 of us that are full time employees. And then we have another, I think, 20 something part time employees that are on monthly stipends versus a bounty structure. Um, we also are in the unique position where we've got contributors with talent levels that are friends of friends. So we've got great people in the design space. We've got great people in the product space. We've got great people across so many different disciplines that it's been relatively easy to find people for roles and projects. Again, where we're kind of struggling is we've got more hands up than we have spaces for people right now. But I think we're of the mindset that we really believe in making sure that we have great talent on board working for the DAO and paying them in competitive wages, so that way we keep that talent, and they're able to stick with us for longer periods of time, and the work output is consistent.
That's a good problem to have.
Yeah, it creates its own set of problems, but it's what my parents used to call an embarrassment of riches.
I think what's really cool from there though is like Patty, you kind of touched on it. It's really kind of having a DAO that starts with the values that attracts the right people in terms of authenticity and the people who are attracted to the mission and the values in the first place. I think what's also really interesting is like this idea of potentially becoming a competitive DAO employer. I think like if DAOs are going to become at a degree of recognition in regards to actually seeing it as an employment opportunity, in crypto, liquid ownership is extremely powerful in the sense that people are able to earn from the contributions to the network itself. But I'm really curious to see if there's going to be opportunities in regarding security, in regards to the consistency of being a full-time versus part-time versus a bounty. And I think that's going to be a really interesting scene that plays out. And I think from there, I think, we touched on it a bit too, but Julia, I'm really curious to see and hear your thoughts in regards to being competitive DAO employer from a talent standpoint, or is that even a thought at a certain level?
A competitive DAO employer?
Yeah, sorry, I was speaking to DAO masters too. I just love to kind of hear the process. No, yeah, feel free to chime in too, Julia.
No,
And
Julie,
both
this
Julias.
one's you.
But,
Well, we have a similar situation to Patty and FWB where we have more hands up than we have slots. And for everyone listening, just to give context on how these things start in the journey, at least I can speak for DAO Masters, is we started with a crowdfund via Mirror, and everyone who participated in the crowdfund got the DAO Master token. And then we invited all of the people with the token to come to our Discord to build with us, assuming that we would likely have to hire separate people to build the product, but allow everyone to follow along. And that's not what happened at all. Out of all the people who participated in the initial crowdfund, we had more than enough people who wanted to contribute and turn DAO Masters itself into a working product DAO. So that's what happened for season one. And then we left our DAO open, allowed any token holder to come in and contribute to any channel, which was cool at first, but quickly created a huge nightmare for the working groups. But because we really believe in building in public and kind of showcasing from the inside out, what we then decided to do was we passed a vote to still allow anyone to see, but to make token holders read only to the contributor channels. And then we added a contributor application process where people could apply whether or not they had tokens to join the working group. And when that happened, we had 27 applicants, and I think we only had another 10 or so slots. And every day more people are asking to apply. And so I think one of the things that's going to make people competitive DAO employers is just having a mission and vision that resonates with people. And at least in the early days of these things, for the part-time or bounty-based contributors, I think it's more about being a part of something and building something that they love. And then as these things scale or become more permanent fixtures, like an FWB or an Orca, then keeping people around full-time and figuring out benefits and figuring out what, how do you offer taxes? How do you offer healthcare? All these things that matter to people's day-to-day is going to become increasingly more important.
That's one of the things that FWB is really working on solving now for its full-time and part-time employees. I think by early next year, we will probably be the first DAO to offer healthcare to our full-time and part-time folks, as well as have sort of W-2 compliant withholding. We want FWB to be a competitive place to work, and we want our contributors to be comfortable. We want it to kind of feel like the best of Web 2 and the best of Web 3, all rolled into one, so the people that work for our DAO are happy and comfortable and not sweating trying to figure out how to do quarterly taxes or how they're going to get health insurance. So it's a priority for us to try to solve next year, and we're going to try to solve it in a way so that other DAOs can replicate it and get their folks taken care of too.
Are there tools out there that help DAOs, manage all of these like Web 2 equivalent qualities, but that are more than needed in the Web 3 space? And maybe that's giving the question to Kaito.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting because I think I briefly touched on it, but this idea of liquid ownership is really powerful. But if I wanted my parents to join a DAO, I think it might be a bit hard to convince them to join a DAO simply because they don't have a lot of the other services associated with just getting paid. So I think that's one thing at Utopia that we've been really doubling down and focusing on, which is not only we can bring in the crypto natives, but how do we actually have what could be considered a DAO contributor as an employee class, right? Those are some of the things that we're trying to think of, and thinking of it from a lens of not only just us, but also society as a whole. So I think, I think there's a lot of those types of things that we are cooking up, and really excited to kind of just push product and have a bias towards action and build something of sustainable value to hopefully, make DAOs something where anybody can join in the sense of risk tolerance and risk mitigation as well. So that's something I've been thinking about, and our entire team has been thinking about, and I think it's going to be a really, really interesting kind of legal moat to build out as well. So we'll see how that plays out.
I guess switching gears a little bit here, this concept of sub DAOs, I think it existed already, but Cooper's latest piece on it has kind of everyone talking about it. Can any one of you just talk a little bit about what that means and how it functions in terms of DAOs?
So FWB is working on, we've got a really active, for those of you who are members, we have an incredibly active and popular NFT channel. We're actually taking that channel and spinning it out into its own sub DAO. So it can independently be its own entity. We'll end up being the parent DAO. Um, and let it do its own, let it breathe its own space, without us, engaging in every move. And then we've got another initiative that we've spun up, which is the local initiative called Cities. And we know that there's already a city DAO, but so ours is called Cities. Right now, we have teams in New York, LA, and London, and we're hoping that each of those cities spins off its own city-based FWB sub DAO. I'm excited. I was excited to see that Cooper was tweeting about it, but we've been kind of working towards this the past couple of months. Uh, my guess is the NFT sub DAO will probably have its own token, and will live mostly independent of the parent DAO.
I
Yeah, just real quick, Julia, just before to add to the definition there. I think what's really novel around sub-DAOs, especially in contrast to internal working groups at a DAO, is that sub-DAOs essentially can be seen kind of like as fluid organisms that can essentially extend externally to the DAO that it was spun up from, or even like start externally. I think we've seen about a couple of years ago, we saw like a lot of guilds and service DAOs spin up that were actually servicing other businesses and DAOs, and start to interact with a number of different kind of like stakeholders in the ecosystem. What we're seeing now is that the idea of sub DAOs, I think, really started, and obviously, Julie, you can talk a little bit more about positive stuff. It really started off as like a necessity, right, to actually scale from and get away from this like utopian vision where every single token holder has like this democratic, super flat structure, utopian vision where like everyone actually makes every single decision for every operational move, right, that a DAO has to make. That's obviously not scalable. It's obviously not efficient. So we started delegating responsibility, right? And that delegation of responsibility essentially went to different subsets of contributors. Those subsets of contributors were normally focused on very specialized kind of like goals or mandates as assigned from the original DAO. But what people started realizing is that like those subset of contributors actually had really interesting knowledge. We're starting to like accumulate best practices as well that could actually be leveraged external to the DAO as well. So I think something that Cooper highlighted really well in the article was that sub DAOs, in contrast to working groups, can actually spin out that initial DAO it originated from and actually work or transact with a number of different external stakeholders, including other DAOs. Right? I think that's like the real kind of unlock here, because that means that suddenly we can now communicate best practices and learnings from different DAOs, like from a DAO across the board. So if a sub DAO in FWB learns something really interesting in kind of like the marketing sub DAO, that can be applied to Bankless, and suddenly we get this like really interesting kind of like meta governance, very fluid network of networks where we're communicating across different DAOs, something that hasn't been happening to date. What we've seen is like information and learnings be really, really siloed. So I think what sub DAOs can do, aside from just also scaling internal operations, they can also help kind of like essentially extrapolate and bring best practices to other DAOs across the ecosystem.
100%. I think Kevin hit the nail on the head. Like I think like one of the most beautiful parts of DAOs, I think, is like the fluidity of these organizations and like your ability to affect change very quickly as a contributor. And like the most basic primitive in DAOs is just people and like human coordination. And I think what we started to realize is like these groups of people are extremely valuable. Like if there's a group of like designers within one ecosystem, like they can like share that value across like to multiple different DAOs. And like I think that's where a lot of contributors currently
it, is that I sort of joke that they're like polyamorous. Like they're not, like we're moving away from like this I work for one company and one corporation for my entire life, but instead I'm working for a bunch of different DAOs or a bunch of different projects in different capacities. And um, I think that's where it becomes really interesting is like you, these like sort of groups of people have a collective power that they understand and can attribute that value across different ecosystems. And that's obviously been like a big part of our vision with Orca in building out pods is that the way that people operate best is in these sort of small working groups and these subdivisions and like kind of fractionalized parts of a larger entity. I think that's, as Kevin said, really important to like scaling internal operations, but also um, I think just like understanding contributors' autonomy and like the value that they can bring to different ecosystems.
I think it's super interesting too. Like, is there just from I know we're super early with this idea of what sub DAOs are in terms of practice as well, but was there a most optimal relationship that you've seen between DAOs and let's just say we can consider them the parent DAO versus the sub DAO? Is there something that is specifically a good practice to implement when it comes down to functioning that, or are we still too early to have any best practices when it comes down to really managing the relationship between the sub DAO and the parent DAO? I'm curious to hear what the team has to say here.
I still think it's too early to say that there are like any standards there. And again, I think it really depends on the ecosystem. I think we've seen like a bunch of different subcommittee pod sub DAO models starting to bubble up. Like we've seen Maker core units, we've seen Yearn's Y teams, we've recently seen indexes, nests, and pods. Um, and I think that they're all sort of figuring out how like this web of subgroups actually works together. Um, so I don't think there's actually like standards there. I think that what we're building is going to be like hugely impactful and helpful in that process. Um, but like, what sort of standards, I guess, would you think we're looking for at this point?
I think it is that we are really entering kind of like this phase of governance 2.0, right? And it's somewhat new. It's maybe 6 months old. I don't even know when Jurgen published that proposal. But it's the essential idea that like it's almost impossible to scale a DAO by actually involving everyone in the decision making process, right? And like it was a hard reality to hit that, like, especially during DeFi summer, we assumed that those decisions could be made by everyone and everyone was going to participate. And we kind of like hit this brick wall, you know, like 6 months to a year ago or whatever, that there has to be this delegation of responsibility. Now, how that relationship evolves, I think everyone really started with internal working groups that just kind of like developed organically. But Kato, to your point, how the relationship evolves and how the sub DAO as well starts to kind of like build different accountability, how the DAO builds different accountability mechanisms to like the sub DAOs and stuff. I think it's really going to be essentially reliant on tooling, infrastructure, and best practices that are established through things like Orca and other solutions that are coming to market soon.
Yeah, I think like the one standard that I would really push is just like ensuring autonomy for these subgroups. Like I think that is like the biggest thing we've seen emerge in like this governance 2.0 model is that like you need to give autonomy to like these subgroups and like these working groups of people, and that's not only like autonomy of decision making but like use of assets, like use of direction, strategy, like all of those things. I think like when you start to like micromanage that activity, you're really like in like sort of blocking some of the potential like creativity and innovation there.
You know, I agree. I think we have in our community, it's really tricky, right? Because we have teams that are spinning up their own proposals, and we've got definitely some community members that are focused on sort of micromanaging the team proposals, right? And they're not understanding why they weren't consulted for their feedback on this or that. And it's hard, right? You know, I feel like if you're super flat, it becomes a challenge to really get anything done in a cohesive way. And you're too top down, it doesn't feel like a DAO. But you do have to delegate or allow teams to sort of figure out and make some decisions rather than having every person that's part of the DAO um, involved in every single decision. And I'm just not sure how we sort of message that across our DAO to our stakeholders that want to be involved in every single decision.
Patty, that's a really interesting point. That different kind of like external stakeholders might want to be involved in internal operational decisions. I don't know if you guys have read this Andy Beal article from his newsletter 30,000 Feet, but he talks about collapsing and expanding governance. The first phase of like governance 1.0 for DAOs was that we reduce kind of like corporate governance structures from kind of like shareholders and board directors and management down to just token holders. Like token holders operated everything. Right. And now the next phase of governance 2.0 for DAOs is essentially that we actually want to expand the realm of governance to different stakeholder types to involve external stakeholders at the very least, and kind of like the accountability mechanisms and the alignment of goals for the DAO, but also extend kind of like the flexibility and autonomy that different departments and working groups within the management and operation of the DAO also have to bring in more stakeholders to the entire system.
Yeah, I think what's relevant here too is like the accountability piece. And I think a big reason why we like haven't seen this expansion grow out further and like this sub DAO or pod model come to life yet is that we're completely reliant on like human to human trust systems. Like the different sort of working groups that are spun up within projects, like sort of the core team is like very familiar with like who's going to sit on those projects, and like there's some sort of relationship there, like off chain, like there's a social relationship that they trust that person to be making decisions on behalf of the organization. And we just don't really have those accountability levers yet to actually be able to like scale basically trust. And that's like a big part of what we're working on with Orca is introducing these like requirements for membership to actually have access. So we sort of think of ourselves as like the permissioning infrastructure of DAOs is like, how do you actually make sure that you're holding people accountable and sort of making sure people are beholden to certain like rules or requirements to actually maintain their access within a certain ecosystem.
I love that. I think it's less about micromanaging and more about setting those structures, defining responsibilities, and holding people accountable so that they can kind of then run on their own, make decisions, and kind of flourish as sub DAOs. I would love to continue this conversation, but I know we are almost close to time, and I did want to bring up people in the audience who've requested access and who want to kind of jump into the conversation. So I'm going to let them in. There are some really cool people in the audience. If you all want to jump in with your thoughts, comments, questions, feel free to do that now. Hey, yeah, we can hear you. Yes.
Every organization will be started, so the cycles will be complete. The segments will be there working proper to create an organization.
You're breaking up now.
Voice is breaking.
Yeah, maybe do you want to rejoin and try again? And in the meantime,
yeah,
Leon, if you want to go.
Yeah, carry on. How is that now? Are you okay? Hello.
Yeah, it should be fine. Feel free
Fine.
to drop your question.
Fine. Yeah. This is the point of view how the organization should be started in the cycle.
Oh, I think we lost them. Someone else wants to go? Maybe AJ?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. I think one of the very important things that everybody needs to consider when designing the DAO that drawing a one-to-one parallels from the corporate governance world would actually cloud the judgment of how to build an effective DAO. And in my opinion, it is not the same thing as corporate governance. And I think there are a lot of people that are trying to kind of like bridge corporate governance with DAO. And I think maybe a good example of that maybe would be like it's more like the governance of a protocol. Think about HTTP or some kind of broader protocol, and how to govern the protocol, which is not the same thing as governing a let's say a corporation. For example, I think I might give maybe an example just for the sake of more clarity. I see the founder here of Ship Here, for example. I'm not sure about what exactly that you do, but let's say it's like a collection of different warehouses around the world, and you want to figure out a way to make these warehouses work together seamlessly. I think building the protocol and then having different warehouses kind of like their decision basically is a stake, and that stake is basically voted for a particular individual, is far more effective way than just thinking, okay, these are shareholders and they need to kind of get a one-on-one a vote or something like that. I think there's just like starting clean, no, not the baggage of the corporate governance world, and then also thinking from a protocol level, what makes something click with a large number of players that are only going to be incentivized by token economics.
Sorry, was there a question?
No, mostly it wasn't a question, more like a comment.
I have a question.
Thanks, AJ, for sharing. Yeah, go ahead.
So I came across a situation where a Solana project, buyers of an NFT, they were buying an ape, and I guess the DAO voted to convert any apes that were priced under a certain amount of SOL to an image of a banana. So in other words, people bought this image of an ape, and then later they found out that their ape became a banana. So obviously the buyers were upset, and I guess I'm wondering how DAOs can organize themselves or do things the right way to avoid this type of situation, because it obviously undermines the entire purpose of the DAO.
That's actually kind of hilarious. I think we need a lot more of these failed experiments, like real issues actually of and real examples of DAO governance breaking down. I think the issue that we've had over like the last 2 years is that nothing has broken. So we assume that like all these governance systems are super resilient, which is kind of like bullshit to a certain extent, right? So what we really need to do is like test these systems out and essentially structure your governance. Number one, maybe kind of like actually performing some, rigidity tests before you actually launch the, like open up the system to every stakeholder. But the second, maybe instead of like, I'm actually designing for, inclusiveness in the governance process, maybe actually put up some barriers, some restrictions, time locks, voting delays, et cetera, and really target, the real decision makers that you really need in your system to be the ones that actually have the power instead of just opening up these insane kind of like spectrum of attack vectors.
I think this isn't great for that particular situation, but I think stress testing these governance systems is ultimately going to be really important, and I'd rather see that happening on low stakes decisions than higher stakes decisions, because then really the cracks are going to start to show.
Awesome. And Leon's, feel free. Do you have a question?
Hey, Kata, how are you? Sorry, guys, I actually just joined towards the end. I didn't realize you guys were hosting, but I just joined when you guys mentioned, I guess, sub DAOs, and I was kind of interested to gauge your thoughts. Over the past few days at City DAO, we've been kind of exploring things like proof of humanity, and also with Krau's House, we're looking at, like, I guess, pods and working pods. And I'm curious to kind of gauge people's opinions on the use of not just a, one person, one vote, or even something like quadratic voting, but utilizing the likes of sub DAOs and smaller working groups and pods to do more of an experience based voting mechanism. So if people perform or are participants in a specific sub DAO, and they have a certain amount of experience, what do you guys think, or is there any opinions from the speakers of applying an experience-based mechanism to DAOs rather than just utilizing, stake?
This is an awesome question. I think Kevin can probably take some of this on like the more complex like voting systems, but when I sort of think about pods and like its utility, I always say I'm like very opinionated about building unopinionated infrastructure. And so like I think what we'll start to see with like sub DAOs and pods is that people basically adopt their own sort of like consensus mechanisms or coordination mechanisms that they can layer on top of that. So that could be voting, that could be compensation, that could be all of these other elements on like how they operate as a small working group, and that doesn't have to be decided from like the DAO level. That can be decided from like a more intimate pod level. So that's kind of like my thoughts on that. But I think Kevin has probably more thoughts on introducing like more exciting consensus funding mechanisms.
No, I mean, I think that's a great point. I think that, when you're designing a lot of these governance systems, there's two things that you can essentially like build for. Number one is the actual consensus or decision-making mechanism, which is the governance system itself. So that could be, token-weighted voting, quadratic voting, futarchy, et cetera, all these like super exciting systems that, some projects are experimenting with right now. But the other side of the coin is actually building very basic systems with the added kind of like benefit of reputational kind of like systems or social status systems or games around how you assign power to different stakeholders. And I think that's been super underexplored, primarily just due to the lack of like primitives. We just haven't had identity or like Web3 activity like primitives to actually help us kind of like come to a conclusion of who's actually contributing what, right? So primitives like Orca, and then what Rabbit Hole's doing as well with that tracking activity, et cetera. All these primitives that are now coming to market are going to be hugely beneficial to us being able to just assign, reputation, status, et cetera, different systems within the DAOs themselves. And then I'd also love to see like more experiments on the governance side, right? Different like consensus mechanisms as well that right now have some experience like on some snapshot strategies and projects, and Gitcoin has been doing amazing work here as well, if you guys go read their blog, but it's been a little bit underutilized, I think.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I think one thing that will lead to this is that, and I do agree with the fact that maybe it isn't the best mechanism currently, but I think that's largely due to the infrastructure that's available. DAO governance and voting isn't necessarily anywhere where it could be. I think the implementation of on-chain identity is like maybe one way, like a standardized on-chain identity mechanism that is cross-chain, cross-DAO first needs to be established to allow for these decisions. I think it's important to also note that things like this would be more so for very sensitive operational things within a DAO, where you may not necessarily want someone who holds a large stake, if it is just token weighted governance, to be able to sway decisions. And I think Krau's House is a really good example. A working pod, if they actually do achieve their goal of buying an NBA team, the idea of having a working pod that has on-chain reputable experience with, whether it be through a basketball video game or even gambling and betting on basketball, they have the opportunity to gain reputation for accurate results, and these person will gain higher weighted voting. And that's just one example, but it would be, I guess, less so focused on overall decisions and more so focused on these decisions within these working pods, because I think delegation works to a certain extent, but people may not want to be delegates, and they may want a looser structure.
Thank you, Leon. Senior designer.
Hey, what's up? Yes. I had just a quick question. So I'm working on a project where I'll be using real estate to fund a DAO, but I understand how to fund it, how I'm gonna fund it. But I wanted to see if you guys can direct me to like the DAO guru, because like I hear what the last gentleman was talking about, and he sounded very knowledgeable as to like what the whole purpose of a DAO is and stuff like that. I have a glimpse a little bit, and the reason I'm doing it is because I know the community would really appreciate it, especially if it's funded by actual real world assets. I just need maybe some tips and stuff like that on how to go about it with the whole utilities and stuff that you guys are talking about. So the DAO guru would be great to follow. So if y'all could help me out there, that'd be great. Thank you.
I would just urge you to keep joining spaces like this. I don't think there's any one DAO god or DAO guru.
Well, crap. Well, I heard you. Yeah, I heard Juliana and then Kevin, and you guys were just like new. I felt like y'all were just like really about it. So I'm like, okay, are these it? So I hit the follow, but I'm like, let me just see if anybody else would point me somewhere else too. So thank you.
We are all DAO gods.
This is a good group of people to follow and just like keep going down that rabbit hole, and I'm sure you will come across the answers you're looking for. Jaya, that's how you say your name.
Yes, hi. I just had a more logistical question. I guess I'm working on a women in crypto community currently, and we're looking towards moving into a DAO. But just during this process, we've talked to a few different people who have said there's a max number of people that can be in a DAO. So I think they've been saying like about 100 people. We were just wondering, just due to avoiding, I guess, any securities issues, is it that you can only have 100 people in the DAO, or would, sub DAOs, as you guys have been talking about, kind of be a way to avoid that?
So I don't think there's a maximum number of people you can have in a DAO. I think whoever, and I'm guessing, and somebody can jump in here, but I'm guessing for a wrap DAO, I think under Wyoming, I think a certain LLC structure caps out at 100 members. So that might be what they're talking about, but I'm not 100% sure. The only time I've heard the maximum 100 members was when we were trying to figure out what the legal structure for our DAO would be, and there are certain LLC structures that max out at 100.
Yeah, that's right, Pat. I think it's Open Law has a framework. It's either called Open Law or Tribute that is actually kind of like linked to an LLC, which is why some Moloch style framework might cap it at 100. But maybe also like another topic that you've been listening to is maybe kind of like what people are calling DAO bars number, which is just like, the max number of people that you can have in a DAO without it, kind of like without having to split it up into subgroups and still have it scale efficiently. But I don't think there should be any restrictions to kind of like total number of members.
Yeah, I think it goes back to is it an investment DAO or it's not an investment DAO? I think that number has been thrown around when you talk about raising an investment DAO, which is essentially acting like a VC fund, but not if you're, what it sounds like you want to do an organization like Women in Crypto, which is more, I don't think, an investment fund.
So I think what we're trying to do, it's more of it'll probably have revenues kind of similar to like a Meta Factory type of model, or Kraus House.
So I know that Kraus House has not figured out what a legal wrapper for their DAO is, and I know that they have a super active Discord with tons of members. My suggestion to you would probably be to reach out to somebody like Larry Florio, who is sort of friend to all DAOs on the legal side, nicest guy on the planet, and he might be able to better help direct you elsewhere. You're welcome to hit me in my DMs. I'll give you his contact information. Super super nice guy.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like to chime in. I think that was a really good question around these DAOs. It's super fascinating what everybody's doing with the governance and everything on that side. I'm a little concerned and have questions about the legalities of this. Because if you look at the SEC rulings from 2017, they ruled that most DAOs or the one DAO that they were looking at, did not, or in the Howey test did not pass. So what they were essentially saying is that when the DAO was selling tokens, if people expect to make any kind of profit whatsoever on those tokens, then that essentially turns it into a security. So then you're dealing with securities laws. So I see some DAOs happening, and I'm concerned that it kind of reminds me of the ICO craze. About 5 years ago when people were doing ICOs, but it was actually breaking regulations. And I'm a little concerned about what's going on with DAOs and that something like that could happen. So if anybody has any more information on developments in the SEC legalities and regulations of the space, I'd love to hear it.
Can I make a really quick comment on that? Sorry, we're actually kind of experiencing that issue right now. So at City DAO, we're aiming to purchase land. So, well, we have purchased land. We've purchased land in Wyoming, but we're using that for conservation currently. The goal is to purchase actual real estate and have these revenue generating assets. However, of course, as you said, even if a DAO does hold a revenue generating asset, even if the members, technically the members would have to experience some form of expectation of return to their token to be fully considered securities, but there is a little bit of gray area around that. So one vehicle that we're using at the moment that is more so a test than anything is using a not a sub DAO, but almost like a sister DAO. And the way it works is that this sister DAO will essentially hold all the revenue generating assets. The core team and I guess a accurate representation of the community will be on the board of that LLC. And then the idea of the community DAO is that then the community DAO then goes and governs that LLC. So there's a certain amount of protection to the I guess token holders of the community DAO, and then the actual investor DAO manages all these revenue generating assets. So you separate the two entities, but you still allow governance of the investor DAO by the community DAO.
We have a slightly different structure in that, and I don't know if you've had how much legal counsel you've had, but it's my understanding there are some pass-through concerns around LLCs. But I am not an attorney. I'm definitely not your attorney. I can barely get up in the mornings some days.
100%. And I'll also say that I'm by no means like a legal expert or anything like that, but it's just something we've talked with a lot of people across the US. And I think there's been a lot of different responses. Some people have been super chill, and then other, larger firms have been like, definitely you can't do this. You should refund everyone. There's been a bunch of different opinions, but I think there's definitely more than one way of doing it. This is just one way that we're looking at.
A couple of our speakers had to drop off, but maybe we can take last two questions. If someone wants to jump in.
I can jump
I had
in.
You can go, Adi. I'll go next.
Awesome, thanks. I would love to get some opinion on quality of contribution. So I've been working with a lot of DAOs and have been continuously seeing or hearing people talk about that a lot of people are just contributing to the bare minimum, and discussions around how to increase the kind of quality, because if it's all just distribution of tips and tokens, it's more on participation rather than the quality of work. And would love to hear how the speakers are trying to solve this problem, and what are the tools being used to ensure that the work or the contribution is of the highest quality.
Depends on.
I really don't think that that monetary incentives essentially kind of like should be a baseline to use here, but monetary incentives are very commoditized, right? Especially in this tight labor market. Essentially, like any contributor can kind of like find their way, right, to match almost any offer from the place. So I think there should be a massive emphasis placed on the communication of the values, the mission statement, right, and the actual community that's being formed before you even started, right, before you onboard any contributors. So essentially, we actually had a discussion about this a week ago. I think it's essentially placing emphasis on the soft incentives instead of the hard ones, and really ensuring that your DAO has a very clear mission statement that can be communicated across the board as you onboard new contributors. Because if they're not there for that reason, it's going to be really hard to ensure quality work just based on compensation numbers. That's just a quick snippet. I'm sure there's 100 million other ways to incentivize good contributions, but that might be getting a bit more into the operations of each individual DAO.
Sorry, y'all. I know there are a lot more questions that are coming in and people wanting to jump in, but unfortunately, everyone here has other commitments and conflicts, and we would have to jump off in like a couple minutes here. So, hopefully we can do more of these conversations, and I'll definitely plan on hosting another one in the new year. But let's do one last question before we wrap up.
I have a very basic question, so hopefully this will be helpful to everyone. You guys are a lot more technical than me, and I just love to hear the justification. I see for certain projects why it's really necessary for a DAO to be on chain and to be tokenized. But I wonder with certain projects where I feel like there should be almost a crossover from Web 2 and Web 3, or maybe they could even be done fully on Web 2 just with sort of a DAO concept around their organization. Do you all see that this concept could be applied in certain things that are off chain and done well that way, or do you see that there's something I'm missing where each and every project really needs to be done on chain and with a token for the DAO to actually function?
I think and I don't pretend to speak for everyone on this call or in DAO land, but I think the very sort of concept of a DAO and decentralized governance is so that there's on chain proof, right? That's sort of the starting point for most DAOs and a decentralized governance. Um, Whether there are things that you can do off chain is really I mean, I feel like DAOs can do anything, right? Like DAOs just went ahead and tried to buy the Constitution, but I think the very essence of a DAO is decentralized governance with some sort of on chain proof of that governance. But I would actually be interested in Kevin's opinion on that, especially because he's our governance expert, I would say.
I don't know about that. I think no one knows what the hell they're doing in this space. But I think to that point, yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. Like if you're starting with the premise, the entire DAO boom started because of the distribution of governance tokens. So theoretically, what all these DAOified protocols were doing was distributing governance rights, governance over, what? Well, really only over protocol upgrades or like capital allocation. So I think to start off with, yeah, it's this is again where we get to the terminology question, right? It's like, what do you call a DAO? What encompasses a DAO? Does a DAO have to have a token? I think, maybe not to a certain extent, and there are some bridges that could be built. But what we'll develop is like better terminology to actually just, distinguish between those differences. There's a really good article from I want to say James Duncan, I think, on the spectrum of different DAOs and like decentralization and the different uses of different governance tokens and rights. If you want to look that up and give it a look, I think that's super interesting. But it is a question of terminology at this point. Like, what do we define as a DAO? I don't know. You could call anything a DAO these days.
I think on that note, one of the things I'm really interested to see is the spectrum. So I think there will be DAOs that are entirely governed with NFTs, maybe with governance tokens, but not necessarily tradable liquid tokens. I think we'll see more DAOs detach the way that they work from the token that's being swapped on Uniswap or SushiSwap, because there is this whole other level of complications of having a liquid token that's both a pro and a con. But the same way that we have different types of LLCs and different types of corporate structures, I think we'll see different types of DAOs. And we're talking about DAOs generally as if they all operate the same. But if you're running a community DAO or a product DAO or a DeFi DAO or an investment DAO, these are all really different. And the way that they coordinate and rally around shared ownership will be different too. And I think the same logic applies for how different teams will sub DAO and how different projects will sub DAO, because they're inherently different, and one governance structure and one DAO structure doesn't fit them all.
I think too the key is, if it's shared ownership, how do you account for this if there's not some sort of governance token to how do you account for that off chain, right? If it's sort of a shared investment in a community, shared ownership in a community, how would you account for that off chain? I think that's sort of the question. And I think if somebody solves for that, then you'll see more DAOs without on-chain governance.
That's a really good point. The token as a ledger system, right? Like keeping tags on what the cap table looks like, pretty much in a community. I like that.
I love that. And I think, just reiterating what Julia said, not every DAO is going to look the same, and it shouldn't. I think there's just so much opportunity in designing different DAOs for different purposes and the governance that follows along. And I think that's what makes the space super exciting. And yeah, I'm here for the journey and to see how it all evolves. But thank you all for joining, especially the speakers, for giving your time today. This was an amazing conversation. I learned a lot. I'm sure everyone did. And would love to continue this conversation offline. But thank you all for hopping in today.
Thank you for hosting. This was an amazing conversation. Chat soon.
Thanks so much for hosting. We appreciate it. And thanks to everybody listening.